Welcome to the Sci-Fi Show, where we talk science and philosophy, usually with two of my favorite atheist philosophers, Alex Malpass and Dan Linford, but Dan is stuck in a storm. And today we're very lucky to be joined by Ken Williford, who is an expert on the philosophy of consciousness. Until recently, he was the chair of the philosophy department at the University of Texas in Arlington, and also my co-author on a bunch of papers we've written on the problem of animal suffering. So welcome to the show, Ken. How are you doing?
All right. Thanks for having me.
Last month, I teamed up with my friend Alex O'Connor to debate Cliff and Stuart Connectley, and I raised what Ken and I call this expanded problem of animal suffering. Now, Cameron Bertuzzi did a reply video, and Alex, Dan, and I did a counter reply. But today, we're going to do one more sort of dive into this topic and review Cameron of Capturing Christianity's more detailed discussion on the problem. And here he's replying to a video put out by Alex O'Connor entitled Christianity's Biggest Problem. But before we dive into the clips, Ken, why don't you explain what is this sort of expanded problem of animal suffering that we mentioned in our paper?
This is, kind of more specific to Judeo-Christian theists who accept, it's not, let's say, who one accept the findings of modern science and try to square that with the Bible. And so they also accept that the Bible is, so they don't just interpret away absolutely every passage. So let's say not completely liberal interpreters of the Bible who might be much more willing to just throw out anything they don't like. They try to do both of those things, right? So we laid out the expanded problem as including 5 kind of sub problems. One is the problem of time, and that has to do with the fact that it seems that there were animals living long before humans were created, at least if we're not young Earth creationists and accept modern science. And so presumably these animals were living and suffering long before the creation of humans. And so if you thought that somehow the fall of humanity by sin could account for animal suffering, well, you can't apply it to that, to the animals living before human beings, unless you adopt this curious retroactive causation model that Dembski, is it William Dembski?
Yeah, Dembski.
That. So, okay, what do we do with all of the dinosaur suffering and so on? Then there's the second sub problem, which is the problem of creation, which has to do with the manner in which, so if you accept evolution, as many theists do, why would God use that method, which entails a whole lot of suffering? And there's also geological catastrophes. So you've got geological catastrophes and just the process of evolution itself, which both entail a lot of suffering. Why not? Here we could say the young Earth creationists who deny the theory of evolution entirely, at least they don't have that. They have other problems, but they don't have that one. Then there's the problem of divine actions, which has to do with the fact that God, according to the Bible, takes actions that lead to animal suffering. So most notably, we might mention the Great Flood, which, if the story is to be believed, annihilated all of the animals except for the ones on Noah's Ark and the fish.
Well, actually, I think even the fish, the salinity of the water have changed with all that rainfall.
Well, let's say,
and actually, the saltwater, the freshwater fish might be okay, but I think the saltwater fish may be in trouble.
They may have been in trouble, but at least in Noah, as far as I know, didn't have large aquariums on the on the ark. So at least some of the fish were going to be okay. Right? But so there's the Great Flood, which drowned, puppies and kittens and ponies and calves and everything, along with all the people that it drowned. So there's that. There's also the casting of demons into a herd of pigs by Jesus, if you take the New Testament. Now, there you might argue, well, it's the demons who suffered, not the pigs anymore, but okay. Still, it looks like the pigs were...
but they all drowned. There's 2,000 pigs drowned as a result of that.
Yeah. So that's the problem of divine actions. And there's the problem of divine commands, which has to do with the fact that God explicitly commands things that are going to cause animal suffering. Not only does it, so to take the most notorious example, 1 Samuel 15, God commands the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Amalekites. And not only does God mention the children, the infants, bad enough, God also is like, and kill the animals as well. What did the animals, even if you bought some kind of story that would purport to justify slaughtering infants and so on, which I don't see how you can do that. But anyway, suppose you could. Why the animals? And then there's Joshua 11:6, where God commands the severing of the Achilles tendons of enemy horses. And you can, of course, you can understand, like from if you're just looking at this in some kind of military way, hobbling the horses would, might be conducive to your victory. But, this is God commanding, punishment or something that's going to cause suffering on horses. And couldn't God have found a different way, especially an omnipotent God? And then finally, there's the problem of the Anthropocene extinction, which has to do with the fact that, well, one major contributor to mass extinction has to do with loss of habitat by a lot of animals. And a lot of that loss of habitat is driven by human agricultural practices that involve, for example, clear cutting lots of forest, say in the Amazon, to introduce grazing animals. And why those grazing animals? So that more humans can eat meat. So couldn't God have made meat not so tasty or something at least? Couldn't God have done something so that maybe we couldn't digest animals? Maybe we were just sort of all vegetarians, by nature, so to speak, by God's hand, instead of this terrible. So I guess you could blame humans to some extent for this, but God certainly could have made it easier.
But he's not shy of making commands about our diets, right?
That's right.
You can't say, well, freedom's so important, he would never intervene in our diets. I mean, he as a Jew, we're given commands not to eat pigs. He commands us not to eat milk and meat together. So you can't really run that argument.
Yeah.
But talking of digestion, actually, before we get into the clips, Alex, I forgot to ask you, what are you drinking today?
Well, I'm drinking a beer from a local brewery, White Print True, but it's an alcohol-free beer indicated by the blue on the logo.
Because it's January?
Yeah, because it's dry January, unfortunately.
Right.
And it's super weird as well. It's basically red. It's like juice, effectively. Beer these days is just like juice. But it's quite nice. It's like a sour. Anyway.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, let's kick into the first clip from Cameron. Now, here it will start with a small bit from Alex O'Connor's original video, but what we really want to dissect is what Cameron has to say.
Loving God likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining.
So I personally think that Alex's view is a bit too strong. While I agree that animals collectively suffer more than humans, it's not all that clear scientifically that any individual animal suffers more than any individual human. In her book, Animals in Translation,
Actually, I just want to pause it here because this is one bit I kind of agree with Cameron. I think Alex's intuition is that animal's life is like some kind of nightmare, that you would sooner kill yourself than swap place with an animal. And I don't share that intuition. I don't know if you guys do, but I think the important point is that it's not needed for the argument. All we need for the argument is that animals do suffer. Alex might think they suffer more. I don't necessarily agree with that, but we don't need that, right?
Can I just let me say a word in defense of what Alex was saying there, because I think the way Cameron construed it was that the capacity to suffer, the kind of neurological capacity to suffer on animals is greater than it is in humans, which is implausible. That was how Cameron seemed to interpret it. But I think what Alex meant was just that the lives of animals, typically in the wild, but, undeniably, it seems to me, in the industrial food industry, are worse than pretty much any humans that you can think of. Now, my dog has a great life because she basically just sleeps on the sofa and gets treats and stuff. And no one would say that her life is worse than any humans or something. But taking an animal in the wild who's, taking the life of a typical ant or something, and then you think like greatly rich in eternal life, of course, but they're basically just coming around corners in encountering huge monsters and things that will tear them limb from limb, and they have to sacrifice themselves, unquestionably, blah, blah, blah. No one really I don't want to swap places with them. I have a lot of animals in the wild I'd want to swap places with, right? And that just goes to show that I think their lives are very difficult, much more difficult than mine. It's not that the intrinsic sort of neurological capacity to suffer is great. It's that their lives are full of hardships in a way that we've kind of removed from most of our lives through agriculture and, inventions and stuff. So I just took it that that's what he meant. Nature.
Oh, I do agree that's what he means. I mean, but I think that there could be animals, I would swap with, like a bird, an eagle might have quite a good life. I'm not sure. All I'm saying is we don't need that assumption to make this argument.
It does sound like he overstated it somewhat. That's right.
Yeah. So let's just go back. Now, Cameron's going to go the other way and say, oh no, animal suffering is less than humans, or at least on an individual level. So let's hear what he's got to say.
Translation, animal behaviorist Temple Grandin gives 2 reasons to think that pain doesn't hurt animals as much as it would humans. Number 1, even when they're, this is a quote, even when they're alone, animals usually, not always, but usually, act as if an injury or disease hurts them less than the exact same injury or disease would hurt a person. That's important. Second, animals' frontal...
Oh, okay, I want to just intervene there, because it's weird. I read Temple Grandin's book, and she actually gives an explanation for why that might be so. And it might be useful to sort of quote from her. I'll just find the quote here. Give me one sec. Here we go. So this is explaining why some animals don't always look like they're suffering. Quote, in the wild, any animal who's injured is likely to be finished off by a predator. So probably animals evolved a natural tendency to act as if nothing is wrong. Small, vulnerable prey animals like sheep, goats, and antelopes are especially stoic, whereas predator animals can be big babies. Cats yell their heads off when they get hurt, and dogs scream bloody murder if you happen to step on their paws. That's probably because cats and dogs don't have to worry about getting killed and eaten, so they can make all the noise they want, close quote. So that seems to be a pretty good explanation. So I don't know why she made that argument. It just seems inconsistent with what she said earlier. But let's carry on with her case.
Frontal lobes aren't as developed as humans. There's some pretty weird studies on this that show that people with messed up frontal lobes aren't really bothered by pain, even when they can feel it. If you're interested, check the description if you'd like to see those studies. But according to Grandin, since the frontal lobes of animals are less developed, it's possible that animals have as much pain as people do. Sorry, this is another quote. Quote, it's possible that animals have as much pain as people do, but less suffering, end quote. Moreover, when it comes to
Okay, Ken. So we wrote a paper about this.
That's right.
And it's a shame that Cameron hasn't read it. And, we made a video about it. We've been on various podcasts and so on talking about it. And it made the science news in some places. So he didn't mention it. Why don't you sort of explain what's going on with this frontal lobe stuff and what you had to say about it?
Well, I mean, I think, as we know, that the claim ranges from things like William Lane Craig saying that primate mammals just don't have a prefrontal cortex, which is not true. To the more kind of plausible claim that they're not even in non-human primates, the prefrontal cortex is just not as developed as it is in humans, which may well be the case, right? But the studies about people with prefrontal cortex damage not caring about their pain, well, we know that this is, it's a bit complicated, but there are plenty of such patients who have hyperpathic pain, especially in the acute phase. And one interpretation of
just explain what hyperpathic pain is, because people might not know what that is.
It's just kind of like over the top extreme pain that you wouldn't, that kind of goes beyond what the actual damage would warrant, or, would be sensible given the actual amount of damage. They still take analgesics and so on, but the point is that it could be, so we actually don't know, but it could be that one reason they exhibit less concern about their pain is that the prefrontal cortex is kind of subserves planning and anticipation, thinking about the future. So they're sort of less concerned about the future generally, so less concerned about the future of their pain. But perfectly well can talk about their pain and indeed identify it as pain. And and indeed want it to be stopped by analgesics and so on. So,
so what I was going to say is there's two different types of pain. One is, there's many different types of pain, but one sort of concern here is acute pain, which is the sort of pain you get when you put your hand on a stove, very quick, very rapid. But then there's chronic pain, which is very long term. So why this argument came about was the people that had lobotomies, their anxiety about their chronic pain was reduced. But their acute pain was just as bad, if not as worse before. So that makes perfect sense because they're not thinking about the future so much, but their present is maybe more present to them. So that's why the acute pain could be worse. And what we had this patient R, and you worked with patient R. Maybe you can, and I think patient R is really decisive in this issue. So Ken, why don't you explain who is patient R and why is he so important here?
So patient R, I was on a team that worked. So I myself didn't work with it directly, but I was part of a team that did. Patient R had really extensive damage to the prefrontal cortex, bilateral damage that wiped out also the anterior cingulate and the insula, other areas of the brain, many of them in one way or another associated with pain, some of them associated with self-awareness. And this patient exhibited, pain, like you could, especially in the acute context. I mean, there were some experiments that patient R agreed to be a part of that did cause considerable discomfort and pain, and patient R did notice them and did express like, yes, please stop that. I won't go into what it was, but anyway. So patient R did experience pain, did have a very developed sense of self-awareness as well, even though areas that are normally thought to subserve that were obliterated in patient R's brain. He had a herpes simplex infection of the brain, which caused all this damage. So patient R is very significant, not only for showing that the prefrontal cortex isn't necessary for pain experience, but also that things like the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the prefrontal cortex are not necessary for self-awareness and a very developed sense of self-awareness. Patient R did have pretty extreme anterograde amnesia, which had to do with damage to the hippocampus. So if you met patient R, you would, and you went away and came back 5 minutes later, you have to reintroduce yourself, right? But otherwise, when it came to pain and self-awareness, patient R passed all the kinds of neuropsychological tests you'd like to administer. So it shows that, lacking these areas. So even if it's true, and it's really much more complicated story, but even if the animals did lack the prefrontal cortex, doesn't mean they couldn't experience pain, doesn't mean they couldn't be self-aware. If I could just add one little thing here, it may be the case that animals suffer less in the sense, just in the very specific sense of anticipating suffering in the future, in the longer term. Maybe they have a less developed sense of the future and what's going on. So in that sense, even I think Daniel Dennett says something like that somewhere. Maybe they suffer less in that sense, but
right. But for acute pain, there's no reason to think that it's less. So when they're getting eaten by a predator, it's going to hurt. And that's the point. That's what we need to sort of run this argument. Well, one thing I thought was kind of amusing, actually, is that the prefrontal cortex actually develops quite late. It takes a long time to develop. Like, it's not fully developed till you're in the 20s. I've never heard any Christian apologists say, we shouldn't worry so much about the suffering of children because, hey, their prefrontal cortex is a lot less developed.
Yeah. You're talking about the myelination, right? The complete myelination.
Yeah. Love to hear that argument. But I think people should read our paper if they want more details. But I think the bottom line is, nowadays, I think the evidence is that pain isn't focused in one part of the brain. It's not all in the cortex, certainly not in the prefrontal cortex. It's probably more like a pain matrix. And if anything is necessary for pain, it's probably more like subcortical regions. And those are widely distributed throughout the animal kingdom. They're very basic, evolutionary, ancient So not having a prefrontal cortex or not having a less developed one, having a less developed one is not really very indicative of less suffering, and it certainly doesn't affect our argument. But there's one last thing that Cameron's going to appeal to. So let's just hear what he has to say about that.
When it comes to emotional suffering in animals, for example, fear, scary things don't really seem to trigger animals the way that we would expect. So for example, studies on rats show that they don't really get scared until they're up close to a predator, even when they know that there's a predator in the vicinity. So in other words, a known predator at a distance doesn't trigger a fear response. And that's not necessarily what we'd expect.
Right. So again, weirdly, he's appealing to Temple Grandin here, but she actually has a really good explanation about this supposed fact. I mean, it's not very well documented fact, so but I'll take it as being true. But let's quote again from the very same book. So open quote, shouldn't a rat who knows there's a cat in the detectable distance be motivated to put even more distance between itself and death by cat? I don't think so. Fear is such an overwhelming emotion for an animal that evolution probably selected for brain systems that keep it under control. She goes on to say, if rats froze in place every time they smelled a cat in the distance, they could be frozen around the clock, close quote. So it seems to me that's a pretty good explanation for that particular thing. So I just don't understand why this is supposed to be relevant. We have very good evidence rats experience fear. And in fact, if you talk to people that develop drugs for anxiety and stuff, they work with rat models. So it seems absurd to me. I don't know what this is supposed to give us. But I think the bottom line is Cameron already agrees that there is in aggregate more animal pain than human pain. And we don't even need to believe that. We just need to believe that animals have pain and they can suffer. But let's go on to the next argument that he's going to make here. There's going to be a little bit less scientific, a bit more philosophical.
Well, we'd expect pretty much exactly what we observe in the real world, a messy bloodbath and a struggle for survival.
So in this clip, Alex says that on atheism, we'd expect to find exactly what we find. But that's not actually what he says. Notice he says, quote, if we assume there is no God and animals in nature are randomly mutating. Alex has quietly, quite cleverly as well, added in an auxiliary hypothesis to atheism, namely evolution. I view this maneuver presents two very serious problems. The first problem is that adding evolution to atheism drastically lowers its intrinsic probability. Intrinsic probability of a hypothesis is just the probability that a hypothesis is true before you look at any evidence. First claim is that adding evolution to atheism drastically lowers its intrinsic probability. And there's basically just two steps to see how this works. The first step is to see that evolution is very unlikely if atheism is true. That's the first step. Evolution requires a few things to get up and running. So amongst other things, it requires the existence of an oxygen-rich planet, a universe that permits life, and on and on. So if all we knew, if this was the only thing that we knew, is that no gods exist, if that's literally the only thing we knew, would the existence of a life-permitting universe filled with animals that can suffer be the next thing we'd expect to learn? Not at all. Again, all atheism says is that there are no gods. That's it. Moreover, if our universe is fine-tuned for life, which it is, check out this video, most universes are life-prohibiting. And since atheism doesn't by itself give us a reason to expect a universe that permits life, again, all atheism says is that no gods exist. It's much, much, much more probable that on atheism there would be no life and hence no evolution. Thus, evolution is actually extremely unlikely if all we know is that there is no God.
Alex, what are your thoughts on this argument?
I think in a way it's helpful to tighten up what we're talking about to some extent. And maybe Alex wasn't very precise in the way that he stated it. So for instance, it's hard for me to know whether what we're talking about is the probability of naturalism given evolution or the probability of evolution given naturalism, right, which could be evaluated drastically differently to one another. Cameron certainly takes us down the path of construing what Alex says as an attempt to say that the probability of evolution given naturalism is very, very low. I think a more fruitful, and I think I just kind of agree in some way that that's right, because he didn't even say naturalism, I suppose, he said atheism. And actually that claim is just so sparse. It doesn't really generate really any meaningful expectations other than that there wouldn't be any gods. Right? It's very difficult to see what else it says. I mean, it's just a negation. It's just saying some X doesn't exist. Now what? Almost nothing follows from that in almost any circumstance. Like, I was trying to think of a good example where you do get some good expectations generated from positing that something doesn't exist. And it's very hard to see anything like that. So the problem is just that the theory, the hypothesis in question is too simple to generate any expectations about anything else. So fair enough, that seems okay. But doing it the other way around does seem a bit more fruitful to me. So like, if we take evolution as our piece of evidence, and then ask ourselves, well, what's now our expectation, given that we see evolution? What's our expectation that the atheism hypothesis is true? Like, does it increase or decrease our expectation that atheism would be true? That seems to be the better way of going about this. And certainly we can compare those two questions. Like, given evolution, does that raise or lower our expectation that theism is true? And it does seem to me that, like, you don't have to be particularly sophisticated with this stuff. Evolution, as we were talking about before, doesn't seem like it would be the thing you'd reach for. When you say, well, theism is true. Now I'm not going to say, oh, there must have been millions of years of like struggle in the natural world and like, that type of slow development. What people would do is what they did before they knew about evolution, which was suppose that God must have made perfect first versions of each of the animals of distinct kinds or whatever. That's what you expect, what people historically expected when they were theists. So it feels like it clashes kind of intuitively with theism. And if you swap over and think, given evolution, how surprising is atheism? I mean, for me, it doesn't actually seem that surprising. I mean, like I'm just thinking, whatever would happen on atheism, it would be indifferent towards our sufferings and our pleasures. So I don't see why it would be protecting us from pains and suffering. It would be a process that didn't care about how much suffering was going on, and that, in broad strokes, is what we see. So I think there is a sort of more charitable way of construing what Alex was talking about. It might have been helpful if he'd been a bit more precise. I mean, it might have been helpful if he'd thought to himself, in a future video, someone will turn this into a sort of strict Bayesian, evaluation, and they'll like be able to choose which of these two ways of construing it and blah, blah, blah. He doesn't need to anticipate all of that. He's saying something that Cameron may have wanted to entertain the more charitable hypothesis. Anyway, that's how it struck me.
What about you, Ken? What are your thoughts on this?
So, I thought he was arguing that evolution is improbable given atheism because life is improbable given atheism, and evolution require life. So that the whole
think that's two arguments he's running. Yeah.
So the whole kind of strategy depended on first thinking, buying the whole idea that life is improbable given atheism, which I don't see how you can get that. I mean, I don't see how you can evaluate that really. Like, just how probable is life given it? As you were saying, to just say atheism is like what really follows. How can you evaluate those likelihoods just given that? It's very hard to know, right? It's also very hard to know how to evaluate the prior probabilities of atheism or theism to begin with. So any kind of Bayesian argument where those priors figure in, you're kind of like, So really, we just kind of look through likelihood comparisons. That's about like the best we can do. And there it seems like, it seems, it's just not surprising. I mean, I kind of take it, the whole general argument to be something like, well, evolution and atheism together predict what we see. Theism and evolution, I mean, they might predict what we see. Like, that's what he's going to say, and I think in the
next bit. We'll come on to that.
But it's like, but theism and would you really, as you were saying, Alex, would you really predict evolution from theism? Certainly, if the history of thought on this issue is any indication, you would not. You would expect something much nicer.
I mean, is this a good way to put it? Like, evolution is in tension with theism in a way that it's not in tension with atheism. Because if there was a God, we might expect him to have processes that brought about human beings that were less violent than what we see. Whereas in atheism, we don't know which process brings about humans. Atheism doesn't say whether Lamarckian evolution is right or whether Darwinian evolution is right.
Yeah.
It just says whatever theory we come up with, God won't be included. So it can allow for lots of different theories.
It could even allow vitalism. Like, life is just a fundamental thing. You could be an atheist and a vitalist,
Yeah, exactly. So it just says whatever theory we come up with won't include God. Since Darwinian evolution doesn't include God, then it's a fine theory to fit under that. It's a broad umbrella, right? It's not a specific. I think the thing is, I wonder if he's treating these two ideas, theism and atheism, as sort of equivalent. But I don't think they are equivalent, because theism makes a claim of how we got here, whereas atheism doesn't make any claims about how we got here. So it shouldn't be forced to make the similar level of predictions. Is that fair? I mean, have I got that right?
I think that's reasonable. I mean, it's almost like basic concept of a deity in this context is a creator of the universe. The explanation for why stuff exists.
Yeah.
So as you say, they are positing there is an explanation, and this is it. Vague though that is, I mean, how exactly? Don't know, but there is an explanation, at least in some respect. But the atheist isn't positing anything at all about why the universe came to be. It's completely silent about that and almost every other topic.
Right. So it doesn't have the same predictive burden that a theory that does say how we got here does.
It's a simpler theory, so it makes fewer claims.
Yeah. I mean, one last thing on this before we move on. I mean, atheism doesn't predict the slaughter of the Amalekites either, right? It doesn't predict that there should be a holy text that commands the Amalekites should all be slaughtered and their animals. Atheism doesn't predict that. So you can't say, you know what, you didn't predict that, so, no points for your theory. I say, look, it's clearly in tension with your theory, and our theory says that your theory is wrong, so good points for us. That's how I think. All right, let's go on to the next clip.
If Alex can just sort of add something to atheism in order to account for animal suffering, then in fairness, it seems like the Christian ought to be able to do the same to Christianity. For example, the Christian could add an auxiliary hypothesis like God has a good reason for allowing animal suffering. This might seem like cheating, but this is kind of what Alex is doing. This hypothesis is going to do the same kind of work for Christians that evolution is doing for atheism in Alex's account. If God has a good reason to allow animal suffering wouldn't be too surprising given Christianity. If necessary, the Christian could help themselves to the exact same theory that Alex used, namely evolution. The Christian that endorses Alex's theory of evolution would actually enjoy all the same explanatory benefits as Alex with respect to animal suffering. He might want to say that he's not adding anything to evolution. He's not adding anything to atheism. Facts about evolution are just sort of common knowledge. Alex's version of evolution is something that we just all know to be true. My issue with this response is that if evolution is part of our background knowledge, if it's assumed no matter what hypothesis we're testing, then it kind of seems like every hypothesis is going to explain animal suffering. Well, why is that? So for the simple fact, evolution does a pretty decent job of explaining why animals suffer. I mean, isn't this like exactly the reason that Alex appealed to evolution in the first place? So if evolution is something that we all know as part of our background knowledge, and this expectation holds no matter what hypothesis we're currently considering, this seems like every hypothesis is going to predict the data of animal suffering. So it's not clear that this maneuver uniquely helps the atheists. In fact, it seems to help everyone, including Christians.
So Ken, this is the bit you wanted to get onto. Can the Christian just add an auxiliary hypothesis that God has a good explanation for animal suffering?
Oh, well, I mean, that's sort of that's what the game is generally. I mean, they all have to say that somewhere along the line. There's some, even if we don't know what it is. So if you're kind of just a skeptical theist who doesn't want to specify specific theodicy possibilities, that's what you'll say. But they all are saying that, even if some think they know. He's going to talk about soul making here in a bit too. So, but I think though the issue is if you add evolution to theism, so it's sort of like his strategy here is to say, well, everybody is accepting evolution, so you're your atheist one and I got my theist one. There's really no. I mean, as you were saying, the evolution and theism are in tension with each other. So you not only have, if you're going to combine those two things, you also got to add this other hypothesis about why God allowed that to be the process whereby, life evolved. Whereas the atheist does not have that problem. They don't have to add an extra little thing. So there's actually, by combining theism and evolution, you find yourself in this difficulty where you do have to add an auxiliary hypothesis that the atheist evolutionist doesn't have to add. So
one thing I was thinking of. Oh, Alex, go ahead.
Well, I think that it's only fair that if we're going to say, like, if a theist wants to say, look, the fine-tuning data is surprising on atheism, right? It seems to me that it's very difficult to maintain that that's true, but also say that evolution is not surprising on on theism, right? If the atheist has, they're supposed to say that this bland theory of atheism, it doesn't have any generate any predictions whatsoever. Still, fine-tuning is supposed to be surprising on atheism, but it's very, unless we're going to sort of give a bit of hand-wavy stuff about like, well, it could have been ran, basically we should assign every possible way the universe could have been equal probability on atheism or something, and then these finely tuned ones are like a tiny slice of the pie, and that's why it's unexpected or something. Like, I guess I can go along with that, but I mean, that's basically all we're doing here, and the other way around when we're saying, look, surely there's some kind of intuitive clash between theism and evolution. It's a messy, long-winded process that involves lots of suffering, and it's not expected. It's surprising on theism, right? And just in the same way that they're trying to say fine-tuning is surprising on atheism. It's really, it seems to me consistency demands, if you're going to say that fine-tuning is surprising on atheism, you have to say evolution is somewhat surprising on theism, right? And I just don't think Cameron's really going down there. All he's doing is saying the two options are we evaluate how surprising evolution is given atheism, or we just put evolution in our background knowledge and just update on something else, like how surprising suffering is or something. That we just those are the two ways. Whereas I'm suggesting, we're flipping around what's conditional on what to see it in a more fruitful way of analyzing it. But if the only other option is to just slot it into our background knowledge, then I think, like, okay, fine. In a sense, he's right. In that case, if evolution is just a kind of like back pocket piece of knowledge that everybody has these days, like basically ignoring the creationists, right? Then yeah, everybody has in some sense, has got some recourse to explain animal suffering. Like, how come? Well, because evolution, and it's messy and it involves lots of animal suffering or whatever. That sort of puts off that one way. We've all got the same answer to that one question. Then we just got a second question, which is, well, how likely is that on this, on the other things that you believe? And then we're just back to the same issue again. So I'm not sure it's like really the panacea that he thinks it is. It just sort of like puts off one question and sort of moves the mess under the rug to a different part of the room, but it's still there. You still have to kind of address that fundamental clash, it seems to me.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking is that evolution is like an accepted fact in science. Like, that's in like any textbook. It's just overwhelming empirical evidence that that's true. Fine-tuning is much more controversial than Cameron likes to pretend that it is. He seems to think that's an established fact as well. So that's going to go against atheism. But, survey of philosophers, the majority view is that there is no fine-tuning. And we've just done a survey of physicists, not out yet, but it's coming out soon. And we asked some various possible explanations for fine-tuning. And the most popular one was there is no fine-tuning. It's a pseudo problem. I can't remember which one it was. Brute fact that needs no explanation was the phrase that they ticked the most. So these two things are not symmetrical. Evolution, established fact, fine-tuning is at least controversial.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my point was just, if you just grant all of that stuff about fine-tuning being established scientific fact just for the sake of the argument, then it doesn't really help, because then it introduces a weird asymmetry that they have to deal with then. But you're right, I don't think it's that they're on the same footing scientifically.
Yeah. And if you are adding an auxiliary hypothesis, presumably different auxiliary hypotheses have different costs. I mean, they're a cost to your ontology. But if you're adding an auxiliary hypothesis that's just an established fact of science, presumably that has a very, very, very low cost. Whereas if your auxiliary hypothesis, God has a good explanation for animal suffering, presumably that's assuming what you want to prove. That has doesn't that have a higher cost? Am I getting that wrong? Or?
Well,
yeah.
Go on, Ken.
No, I think so. I mean, it ought to. It ought to count against it if you're kind of weighing these things. Yeah, seems to me it does. I mean,
yeah. Well, I think there's this thing about, like I was saying at the beginning, it's nice that we're talking in Bayesian terms because it makes things clearer. But in a sense, it's sort of not nice because actually there's some like ersatz formalism or something going on, ersatz precision with using Bayesianism so often. It just comes down to, well, I feel like this is my prior, and I feel like this will be the updating effect of this evidence on this hypothesis or whatever. And then all the rigor goes out the window because we're just waving our hands around. But now I've forgotten what I was going to say. Oh yeah, the thought that what's going on when you increase the proposition that's being conditionalized upon by adding in another hypothesis like evolution and naturalism or something, and calling it an auxiliary hypothesis. It's in a way, it's almost like a derogatory term calling it an auxiliary hypothesis, because like the term, auxiliary ad hoc hypothesis, it's normally what's going on in a degrading Lakatoshan paradigm, right, where the research project is not productive anymore and people reach for, so take the flat earther case where someone's like clinging desperately to this flat earth hypothesis, and you present them with like pictures of the earth from space, showing clearly the curvature, and they said, oh, you don't believe all those NASA photos, they're all faked or whatever. And that's an auxiliary hypothesis, an ad hoc hypothesis, because they're just coming up with it now for no other reason than to defend the hypothesis, right? It's not the same as just like strengthening the proposition that's being conditionalized upon, by adding in another, literally textbook scientific fact, right? That's not the same. And I think that there's the effect that it engenders is it's like these are just the same move as when later on, in my view, and probably both of yours as well, we see this kind of appeal to, well, maybe animals get resurrected with full rationality in heaven. Like, that does sound like an auxiliary ad hoc hypothesis, because despite the sort of one or two bits of the Bible where if you squint at them a bit, they kind of look like maybe they say something like that, it's just made up out of whole cloth as a theodicy in order to save the theory, right? So I think that it's almost like poisoning the well to say recourse to evolution is an ad hoc auxiliary hypothesis, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, before we get onto the soul making, let's go on to the other theodicy. Now, for people that don't know what a theodicy is, that is an explanation for why God might allow suffering. So quite a famous one is called nomic regularity. So let's hear what Cameron has to say.
What is nomic regularity? Nomic regularity, how many times can I say that? Is the idea that the natural world is orderly. The world operates according to law-like processes that have few or no exceptions. So to get this theodicy going, it's kind of helpful to imagine a world that has no regularity, a world that is just completely chaotic. So two negative results are apparent right away. So first, biological life would not exist in such a world. Animals, both human and non-human, are the result of an orderly process, whether it was through special creation or evolution, but none of this would be possible if the world was described by chaos. Second negative result is that nothing like moral choice would remotely be possible in such a world. In a chaotic world, we wouldn't be able to make any of these predictions. And without the ability to make accurate predictions, moral choice goes completely out the window. So the gist of this theodicy is that nomic regularity makes certain goods like biological life and moral choice possible. Some philosophers have even argued that nomic regularity itself is a great good. However, with these goods comes the reality of animal suffering. Listen to this really good quote from Daniel Howard Snyder. Quote, in general, the sources of natural evil which afflict non-human animals and us, disease, sickness, disasters, birth defects, and the like, are all the outworking of the natural system of which we are a part.
Right. Now, I just thought I could play the next bit just as a sort of light-hearted contrast here, because we've just heard the defense that animals have to suffer because God would not want to intervene. He doesn't want a world without these incredible regularities. But then Alex and I tackled this in our last video. Cameron sort of asks these questions of atheists, and obviously driving the potential for miracles to happen. So let's just hear what he thinks is going to be a gotcha question for atheists, and just think about how these two ideas sit with each other.
Proportion our beliefs to the evidence. But then you also think that we've got this unique way to verify whether or not God exists through studying miracles. How many of the millions of miracle reports throughout history have you actually deeply investigated?
Yeah. So it seems to me there's quite a tension there between saying, yeah, we've got to allow all this animal suffering because God can't be intervening left, right, and center. And then, have you looked into the millions of miracle claims that exist? And, presumably of some plausibility, otherwise you wouldn't be mentioning them. Ken, what are your thoughts on this nomic regularity theodicy?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a bit unimaginative to think that an almighty God would be, so suppose then there must be nomic regularity, but like, why these laws? Couldn't God have been a little more, benevolent in picking the nomic regularities? And to think that, God had to choose exactly these, or that these were the best. How could you possibly know that? So this always strikes me as a bit odd. And it's also like, why is nomic regularity that important? There's a whole tradition in Christian theology of thinking that really there aren't any laws like that. Like, there's really just God's decrees. And when God, and so this, of course, allows for miracles. If you think, yeah, they're not really laws. They're just sort of like God's usual rules of thumb that he picks for, mysterious reasons or aesthetic reasons or whatever God's reasons are. And miracles happen when God, suspends them. Or just take all the miracles you like in there and make them just like part of like disjunctions and call those laws, like put a bunch of extra, unless this is happening. And unless it could just, it's basically regular, but but it's not a universal generalization. Like, I just think it's, unimaginative and not particularly, not really sensitive to actually the history of the issues. There are plenty of Christian philosophers who thought, they're not really laws. And in fact, after Spinoza, people got kind of freaked out because Spinoza thought, like, look, if these are laws, then they have absolutely no exceptions. So miracles are impossible the way y'all define miracle. This is of miracles in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus. And that kind of like made people rethink the whole, God, what do we say about nomic regularity? So I just, there's a picture of God according to which everything happens by God's decrees. And why is that less befitting of Almighty God than a God who establishes natural laws that admit no exception? Oh, and then enter in, then have some exceptions anyway. Like, it's kind of an incoherent picture. So it's like, if you're going to have miracles, the kind of occasionalist tradition, where it's all just by God's decree, seems to make more sense to me. And then, of course, why isn't God like intervening every time a stray bullet's about to hit a kid in the head or hit an animal for that matter? Like, why isn't God intervening?
Right. One thing I was thinking of, some of the alternative laws could be, like, one of them could be neo-Cartesianism, right? So this is a view, not everyone might know this, but this is a view that says animals are sentient, they have consciousness, but their pain has no moral significance. So maybe they're not aware of it, or it doesn't have that sort of valence, the negative valence that we associate with it. Now, not only could that be true, God could have made the world that way. That would still allow moral choice. It would still allow regularities. And some theologians think it is true, right? I mean, William Lane Craig famously thinks that's true. C.S. Lewis has an argument like that. And they said, we should praise God for this Craig said, we should praise God for his wonderful care of creation, for installing this. So presumably he could have, right? I mean, obviously, empirically, we think this falls, but that wouldn't stop nomic regularity. Alternatively, we could make minor adjustments. Like, imagine an animal had an aversion to, we have this thing in our paper about a tar pit, which is where an animal gets stuck and they starve to death, and then other animals come in, try and eat them, and they starve to death because they're stuck too. If they just had an aversion to that, like they have an aversion to fire, like they know instincts to avoid fire.
That's right.
Imagine they had an instincts to avoid the predator trap. Would that really lead us into a topsy-turvy, Alice in Wonderland, crazy chaos? Well, it's like a false dichotomy. Like, you either have all this laws, you have to allow all this animal suffering, versus, no animal suffering or less animal suffering. It just seems a false dichotomy to me.
That's right.
The other 2 points I want to make about this is that our version of the problem of animal suffering, this expanded problem, is immune to this nomic regularity, because we have these problems. Like, 3 of our problems are the problem of divine action, problem of divine commands, and the problem of the anthropos. Well, at least the 2, the divine actions and the divine commands, I should say, actually. These are times where God intervenes in nature, right? He's intervening, he's interrupting the regularity of the world. So when he sends the flood, that is an intervention. You can't say, well, he sent the flood because he wants a regular world, right? That is an intervention in the world.
Right.
In fact, I want to say that it makes the problem worse, because I think of the flood, let's say, I'm just giving that as one example, as bad because all these animals drown, right? So that's a bad. And I wouldn't expect a good God to do something bad. But now I've got another bad, which is the intervention in nomic regularity, because that's supposed to be a great good, right? So now you've got 2 problems. Why did God intervene in the nomic regularity, which is his great good, and why all the suffering accompanied with it? And 2 problems is not better than 1 problem. Alex, what are your thoughts? Nomic regularity.
Well, I think completely that it's a false dichotomy. And I think the way that Cameron set it up was very evidently displaying that, because the way he painted the picture, I mean, obviously it's just a video and it's very quick and he's not really a philosopher, so I don't want to be mean or anything, but like just taking the words that he said at face value, it's not a choice between regularities and no regularities, right? They come on a scale. I mean, you can imagine a world at one end with no regularity. I mean, I think I can imagine. I'm not even sure this makes sense, but like a world with no regularities whatsoever. What's that like? I don't know. It's a bit like sort of white noise or something. It's just there's nothing at all. Right? It's just, I don't know. I can't really picture it. But and then on the other end, you've got like something where like, you know, everything's going to like radically conforming to law. So everything's just like some kind of quartz crystal or whatever, where it's just this like everything's, you know, the same or whatever. But in between there's a huge variety of things. And it seems to me that it's not quite clear that we have established conclusively that there are laws, actually. I mean, I know there probably are, obviously, right? But the real extent, the metaphysical kind of extent of those things does seem to me that we don't have to have any particular view about that. Like, for instance, maybe gravity is a temporary phase, right, in which the universe grows out of it after a while. And I don't know, I'm not physicist, I'm just making stuff up, but no one really knows everything, do they? So there could certainly be the case, as far as I know. I can imagine that. And if that was right, then actually gravity isn't really a nomic regularity. It's just a kind of good enough for right now around these parts for me to make predictions with. But that's actually all that really matters, because he was saying, well, if there was no regularities, then it'd be like no moral significant choices, and you can have life and stuff. But no, you could, right? Because all it needs to be, we know that all you need is as much regularity as we actually currently have, right? Whatever that amount is. And we just don't know exactly the extent to which we have that, because as I just said, there are these like weird hypotheses where the regularities are only sort of temporary or fleeting or imaginary or something. As long as you can make predictions, as long as you can use them to make moral significant decisions, that's all you need. So you could have quite a weak notion of that, it seems to me.
And why wouldn't, if I may follow up, just, moral choice, right? I mean, okay, suppose that every time somebody tries to commit murder, it's thwarted by divine intervention, right? Well, that's still a significant, that's attempted murder. You're still on the hook. You're still on the hook for attempted murder. Yeah. So it's like you could still have moral choice with this kind of, more or less regular world with a little bit more divine intervention in it, right? Like it would still be like, oh yeah, you tried though, but you tried, and you're on the hook for that. So I don't see why it eliminates, significant moral choice if you have more divine intervention. Right?
Yeah, actually, there was a TV show in England called Red Dwarf, and one of the episodes is a sci-fi comedy show. And one episode they go to this prison planet, and the prison has no walls, has no gates, no locked doors. But what happens on the planet is that anything bad you do goes back onto you. So the guy says, go and test it out, to set fire to my jacket. So he sets fire to his jacket, and his jacket catches fire. And it's like, why didn't you tell me that beforehand? But the point is, there's still a moral choice there. The consequences of the choice go back onto you, but, you still have a moral choice, it seems to me.
Yeah, seems like it. I mean,
and actually, one last thing I want to point before we move on is I was going to say the last point of our expanded problem was this problem of the Anthropocene. It seems like God could solve such an enormous amount of suffering for animals by making it either hard for us to eat meat or impossible for us to eat meat. That could make like one genetic mutation or something.
Yeah.
In fact, what was found recently was that people that have tried to go vegan and couldn't, or that gave up, it turns out there's a genetic predisposition. Some people find it harder to do that than others. Now, God could have just switched that gene off.
Yeah.
Or one tiny, is that really going to give us this crazy Alice in Wonderland world if you make that one crazy mutation?
Like Hume says in the dialogues concerning natural religion, he could have like tweaked Caligula's brain just a little bit in infancy. So that Caligula doesn't end up being such a monster, right? So it's like, what? Nobody would notice. Nobody,
right?
Like,
yeah. I mean, couldn't it have made Adolf Hitler slightly better at art? Then maybe If you'd just given him slightly better abilities at art, he would have got into art school. He wouldn't have had all that resentment. You don't have to kill him as a baby. Just, give him slightly better artistic abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Caligula only goes mad after he suffers some kind of some disease or something. He's like unconscious, and so he wakes up mad, according to the histories. Because there's some senator that was at his side professing, oh, take me as long as my emperor will awake, take my life or whatever. And Caligula wakes up and finds out that he said that, and he's like, "Oh, so you'll be killing yourself now, then, will you?" And the royal senator to be like, "Oh, I guess are you taking that literally?" And he's like, "Yes, I am. Go and kill yourself right now." And that's like one of the first signs that he'd changed. So he could have just intervened in the stroke or whatever it was that he had a little bit to make him a bit less crazy when he woke up.
Right. All right. So let's move on to the next theodicy's soul making.
Suffering is necessary for creatures to exercise the greatest goods, and the greatest goods being the exercising of virtues. So goods like sacrifice, courage, and forgiveness, these can't be attained without serious suffering. That's the first element. The second element is that suffering is necessary to shape our character toward the good. Developing a good character is obviously a very good thing, but that can only be achieved if we're exposed to suffering. Soul building doesn't necessarily require an animal afterlife. In his book, Providence and the Problem of Evil, the OG Richard Swinburne argues that animals can exercise virtues on Earth. The lion that is attacked and injured, for example, can courageously fight to live on. And animals might not know that they're exercising virtues, but many humans also don't know that they're exercising virtues when in fact they are.
Ken, tell us, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, what can I say? I mean, I admire my dog that survived 2 weeks in the wilderness, lost, and got caught in a coyote trap and and survived. We were very happy. And he's more resilient. He likes to eat acorns and squirrels, so we have to but he is resilient. That's a virtue. He's very touchy about his food, though, much more than he was before the incident. So is that a virtue? I don't know. Did it build his soul? I don't know. But I find it just kind of like what I don't know what to say about this other than to kind of make a bit light of it, but maybe
I think there's something kind of repugnant almost about the what's the word? The offering or something, right? That's supposed to be given here. Like, I think Swinburne's idea is that the manifestation of higher order goods, right, like charity and mercy or whatever, justifies, because you can't have charity unless somebody is poor, right? You can't have mercy unless somebody's suffering or whatever. So you need the bad thing in order to manifest this higher good thing, right? But fine, that's true. Obviously, trivially, you can't have charity without somebody to give stuff to or whatever. But it just feels like it's not worth it, right? Like I don't want to be poor so that you get the opportunity to give me money and develop as a person. Right? I don't want that deal. Thank you very much. Like it seems like there's something almost colonial about Swinburne's perspective here, because he's just seeing it through the eyes of the kind of European person who happens to give a farthing to this poor Indian boy as he walks past him and feels good about himself and thinks, oh, that must be the reason why God made all of these dastardly Indians who are starving all the time, so I can make them feel better with my gold farthings every now and again.
Right.
Something I'm characterizing it, obviously, but there is something sort of uncomfortable about that. I think that I once did a sort of debate thing with this guy Randall Rouser, who's a sort of Catholic apologist and I guess philosopher. And he's a nice guy and he's quite thoughtful as well. But he was trying to suggest to me that something like military vets, when they go through a conflict and then they come out the other side, say with a leg blown off or something, and they go through recovery, and often they grow as a person. And they say it was the making of them. We wouldn't change it or something. But it seems to me that people, it's just a survival kind of instinct or something to see the best in your situation, regardless of that. I kind of feel like if you could really say to them, well, here's a new medical technique that will give you your leg back, but you now won't have all of the kind of character building suffering that you've gone through. I kind of find it very hard to believe that someone would choose to stay in the wheelchair rather than just have their legs back or something. And that just exposes that it's not a good deal. Like maybe, charity is a higher order good that couldn't be manifested without the suffering. But still, I just don't think it's worth the price. No thanks. I'd rather have a nice, peaceful, contented life, even if I don't learn all of these so-called deep moral truths that you only get from sort of being a Holocaust survivor or something. I don't want to know that. I'm happy to just, chill, eating snacks on the sofa. Thank you very much.
It's funny that you mentioned a Holocaust survivor, because Trent Doherty is someone we're going to come on to. So he's written a book about animal suffering and endorses a version of soul making. And he talks about Holocaust survivors, and he's like, these are great saints, or some, in certain cases, because they look back on the suffering and they see how it grew them as a person. And we were thinking, well, so he was basically arguing he classes them in some sense as saints. I mean, it's a bit more complicated as to how you define a saint and everything. But the point being is, there's more saints than people who have been crushed by their trauma. So we thought, let's have a look at the empirical data on this, because in fact, it turns out the Holocaust survivors have a much higher rate of suicide than controls. So in fact, there's for every case of, someone who's felt that their trauma made them grow, there's another person, and maybe 2 or 3 other people, who felt it was crushing, who got post-traumatic stress disorder and ended up killing themselves. So there may be cases where suffering has improved someone's character, but we can point to plenty of other cases where the exact opposite has happened. And another thing about Doherty's book was that he gives this example of a sort of adventure rope course. And he says, look at the stress that people went, they were crying. I mean, it's scary doing some of these activities. Imagine doing like a bungee jump, for example. It's quite scary. Say again?
Or skydiving, presumably.
Skydiving, yeah. But actually, I'd say bungee jumping is maybe more scary because you're so close to the ground. I mean, skydiving is scary in some sense because I think I'm much more likely to die. But actually, bungee jumping might be a better example because the risk is very, very low on a bungee jump. I mean, it's quite low on the skydive too. But you are, quite scared. Your brain is really telling you you're about to kill yourself, and Trent Doherty, he gives the example of an adventure rope course. But the point is, you could develop those virtues of courage with much less suffering. Therefore, the amount of suffering seems completely unexplained by the suffering that we see. And actually, the example Cameron has in a different video is he shows this clip of someone's child being murdered, and then not the actual murder itself, but afterwards, I think it was a parent of the victim forgiving the murderer. He says, "What a beautiful moment! What an incredible thing!" And I'm like, well, maybe that is beautiful, but would you want your child to be murdered so that beautiful moment can happen?
Exactly.
Again, Alex, it's like bad deal, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
I mean,
also, there's lots of examples in animal suffering where there doesn't seem to be any opportunities for soul making. So, again, imagine the animal trapped in the tar pit. What opportunities for soul making are there? It seems none, as far as I can tell. So it just seems like it's just completely unapplicable. But
this is why I was kind of struggling to articulate what it would really mean for animals to have their souls made by suffering, and what virtues are you talking about,
I mean, Swinburne has a lion. It can be ennobled by, defending its children or something, its cubs. But it seems to me that, again, a bad deal. A sinner would not have its cubs eaten, probably, or starve to death if they can't find food or something like that.
For it to work, like for the theodicy or the strategy to work, the goods that are attained through the process really have to, significantly outweigh the bad that is required in leading. I mean, it's just not at all obvious. And then, as you say, tons and tons of people and presumably animals are not ennobled for whatever reason. They have very different. So I always like to contrast, say, Dostoevsky's attitude towards suffering, which is kind of like, yes, it's soul making and ennobling, versus like Somerset Maugham's in Of Human Bondage, which is about, no, it just makes you like bitter and can completely break a person. And it's like, okay, it's true. There are these examples of people who are ennobled, and we can all recognize that, given the circumstances, that's a better outcome. But then there are all these others, and just as relevant to the problem, and maybe there are more of them, as you were saying about the suicide rates of Holocaust survivors. And in any case, even if not, does it really, does it really outweigh the bad? It's not at all clear even if it
Well,
were
that's where it leads to this afterlife soul making. So let's hear a little bit about the justification for why animals might even have an afterlife. So let's see.
I think that the strongest version of the soul building theodicy will involve animal immortality, or doggy heaven, to use Alex's terminology. And I realize that a good chunk of my audience will probably scoff at the idea of animal immortality. So I think it'd be wise to sort of pause the soul building theodicy for a second and offer some biblical and philosophical considerations in support of animal immortality. So it might surprise you to learn that many of the early church fathers seemed open to animal immortality. According to Father Christopher Steck, he's awesome, by the way, quote, early Christian thinkers typically expected that Christ's redemption would include all creation, end quote. So while these saints didn't necessarily come out and explicitly endorse animal immortality, their writings seem to implicate as much. According to Steck, Irenaeus, Ephraim the Assyrian, Athanasius of Alexandria, John Chrysostom, Maximus the Confessor, and even Augustine all had writings that implicated belief in animal immortality.
Maybe.
Right, so I've got a few quotes from Steck myself, because I think Cameron's missed out some content here. So let's have a couple of quotes from the very same book. Open quote: "The view that God would restore creatures, however, was generally dismissed as offensive to Christian sensibility and an absurdity to Catholic thinkers." He also said, quote, "Historically, animals were assumed to be excluded from a life to come." And last quote, "When the Catholic bishops of England and Wales received a proposal for liturgical prayers for animals, they rejected it because animals may well have souls, but they are not immortal souls." So I think there's something sneaky about the way Cameron phrased it here. So I wrote down exactly what he said. He said, so while these saints didn't necessarily come out and explicitly endorse animal immortality, their writing seemed to implicate as much. So what he's saying is that the people that just the long list he had, they didn't actually say that animals have an afterlife, right? So he's just interpreting them as saying that they have an afterlife. And actually, the way I think about this redemption, some of them talked about redemption of all of creation, but I just interpret that as saying, well, in the future, there will be no predators, no predation. There will be a beautiful world where lions don't hunt antelope. But that doesn't mean that the individual animals are getting an afterlife. And in fact, I think it's worth noting, that the tradition, particularly, Cameron's a Catholic, right? So the Catholic view is that you need a rational soul for moral worth and presumably then for an afterlife. I mean, if you don't have any moral worth, then why does an afterlife even needed? And, Aquinas was very strong on this, saying, animals don't have the rational soul. And in fact, you can still hear this being defended today. And in fact, I'll just play a little clip of someone defending this view today, very recently. So because it's this whole point about the rational soul. That's the important issue.
What his view is that animals don't perform the three acts of the mind. They don't have a rational soul, and they're not persons, so their suffering is not morally significant.
Right. So that's kind of the point here, that when we see, I thought it's incredible that he quoted Augustine, because, if you read Augustine, here's a few quotes, and keeping this idea of the rational soul in check here. So open quote from Augustine. This is in Catholics and the Manichaean Way of Life. So quote, "Inasmuch as we can perceive by their cries that animals die in pain, but then we make little of this, since the beast, lacking a rational soul, is not related to us by common nature," close quote. And another quote from the same book, open quote, "Christ himself shows that to refrain from the killing of animals and the destroying of plants is the height of superstition. For judging that there are no common rights between us and the beasts and trees, he sent the devils into a herd of swine, and with a curse withered the tree on which he found no fruit. Surely the swine had not sinned, nor had the tree. For we are not so foolish to believe that a tree is fruitful of barren of its own free choice." So, Aquinas, said, a quote from Aquinas here, "When we hear it said, 'Thou shalt not kill,' we do not take it to reference for trees, for they have no sense, nor to irrational animals, because they have no fellowship with us. Hence it follows that the words 'Thou shalt not kill' refer to the killing of a man. Dumb animals and plants are devoid of the life of reason, whereby to set themselves in motion they are moved, as it were, by a kind of natural impulse. A sign of which is that they are naturally enslaved and accommodated to the use of others." So it seems like Cameron's sort of papering over this huge tradition of Christianity that denies souls to animals.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, but it seems to me, this is the same with Doherty, that, they just want to find at least some people in the tradition who are sympathetic to it, because that's what they want to. Because I mean, they can always just say, "Yeah, well, Aquinas was wrong and Augustine was wrong," and who's the one that they
Basil the Great.
Yes. Oh, well, we know about that, right? That's not even.
Yeah. We should just say that Basil the Great, because Trent Doherty quoted him as being, sympathetic to the idea of animal mortality, I guess. And the quote was from like these prayers. And when we dug into it, we found that these prayers for animals are actually forgeries.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at what Basil actually said, I've got the quote here. So Basil, people don't know, he was a 4th century theologian, I guess.
Church father.
And yeah, so he wrote, this is what he actually said about animals. So this is from the Hexameron, homily number 8. Quote, "You will soon learn how the soul was formed. Hear now about the soul of creatures devoid of reason. Since according to scripture, you will find that the soul of beasts is earth. Do not suppose that it is older than the essence of their body, nor that it survives the dissolution of flesh. Avoid the nonsense of those arrogant philosophers who do not blush to liken their souls to that of a dog, who say that they have been formerly themselves women, shrubs, fish. Have they ever been fish? I do not know. But I do not fear to affirm that in their writings, they show less sense than fish." Close quote. And that was one of the very Christians that Doherty appeals to, as saying, yeah, there's a long tradition of this in Christian thought.
Well, Origen, the church father Origen, my understanding, could be wrong with this, but my understanding is that he was excommunicated. He's like a 1st century church father, excommunicated, 1st or 2nd, excommunicated because he believed in transmigration of souls, and that, there could be a kind of, you could go be an animal and that's part of your sort of purification. He was a universalist about rational souls, but he thought like your soul could go into an end, and that's why he was excommunicated. So it wasn't the universalism per se, it was the transmigration component, which would mean that animals could, be ensouled by formerly human souls. So,
Alex, anything you want to say before we move on?
Well, I've been listening to what you guys have been saying. I've forgotten what Cameron said.
Well, he basically said, look, there's a tradition of Christian thought.
Oh, yes.
Animal afterlife.
Well, the Catholic tradition of appealing to tradition is the thing that the appeal to authority fallacy was primarily designed to counter. I mean, I don't care that Irenaeus said the animals go to heaven. Why did he say it? Right? It doesn't matter that Augustine said it, right? Pythagoras, pretty good with angles of triangles, but he thought beans were evil. It doesn't matter that one guy said we're not getting why they said it. So as a philosopher, I don't care about appeals to what one of the church fathers said. I want to know why they were saying it. Otherwise, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think what they're trying to do, though, is sort of soften up other Christians who might be disposed to be against it. To be like, oh, no, it's not. There have been some famous Christian authorities who did hold this view. So you're not going to go to hell if you.
Yeah, I get that, but I'm such an arrogant philosopher that I think that even the people who are Christians, to whom that's aimed, because obviously it's not aimed at me, but like, even as you're a Christian, you should think, well, it's pretty cool that Augustine said this, but why did he say it? Like, what was motivating him? I kind of feel like even if you directly quote a verse from the Bible, where it's even if it exactly said all dogs go to heaven in the Bible, I'd still want to say, well, the human who wrote that down, how did he know that was true? I mean, like, what's his reasoning? Like, where does that come from? Does God just literally just give him the words and he doesn't know what he's saying? It's just sort of like a cipher or something that's just coming through him, like a medium or something. But otherwise, if he's thinking it through himself, he should presumably have his own reasons. And like, what are they? And then really it just doesn't matter about the context. The only thing that matters is the reason. But I guess, so my blinkered world, win that.
You're worshipping at the altar of human reason.
Yeah.
Well, but it's interesting though, because, Augustine was like, well, look at the story of Jesus and the swine. What he's basically saying is animals don't matter, because if they did, we wouldn't have that story. So this, I think, might be an argument we can use against Christianity. Like, God knows the future. He knows that church fathers like Augustine are going to say, and Aquinas are going to say, animals have no moral worth, because look at the Bible, Jesus, drowns all these pigs. You know, wouldn't he want to alter the text to make sure or make it clear if animals do go to heaven and we're going to be hanging out with them in the afterlife and going, oh shit, I ate your brother, you know, you know, wouldn't it be some value for him to actually make it explicit that, you know, animals are going to be with you in heaven, because then maybe we would treat them better. And he would know that Augustine's going to say this. He would know that Aquinas is going to say this. And he could steer them, you know, to not saying it.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, but apparently there are passages in the Bible. So we'll just have a quick look at the Bible passages. Should we skip those and go on to the Beneficence?
Briefly, because
all right, go on. Let's see the Bible passages.
First is Isaiah 11:6-9. Quote, "The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." World. So while this passage obviously includes some poetic elements, many biblical commentators interpret this chapter to support animal mortality in the afterlife. And if you just read through it, it's pretty obvious to see why. All right, our next verse is Romans 8:19-21. Quote, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." End quote.
Yeah.
All right, Ken, you wanted to play these 10, so what do you have to say about
that second passage about, you know, like, what does that passage actually say? You know, like, it was not subjected to futility willingly, but because of the will of him who subjected it, in the hope that I just find that to be like one of Paul's more obscure pronouncements, I would say. So as a proof it's not a great proof text for animal immortality. It's not really clear what is being said there, it seems to me.
Right. There's no explicit statement. Animals are going to heaven. Why not? Why not just say it?
This is even, it seems to me this is done, it's historically peripheral, marginal view that some people thought and that has some interpretive backing to it. But it's, you know, again, this is just a quick video of his, and it's you know, it's not really it's not like a book like defensive or whatever, but like, presumably, you know, if we were going to count all the different interpretations throughout history of those passages and stuff, they weren't mostly about animal immortality, because it's not a central doctrine of, say, for instance, Catholicism, whatever these days. It's still peripheral and has been throughout history. And then the obvious truth is that it's not a central part of Christianity, and it never has been. At best, it's been peripheral, and I think realistically, it's just been non-existent.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's move to a more philosophical argument for an animal afterlife. So let's see.
The argument we're going to cover in this video is called the Beneficence argument, and it goes like this. Premise 1, if an agent can benefit an individual with moral standing, and there is no sufficiently good reason for the agent not to provide the benefit, the agent has a duty to so benefit the individual. Premise 2, non-human animals with interests are individuals with moral standing. Premise 3, God is an agent who can benefit non-human animals with interests by giving them eternal, infinitely good afterlives. 4, there is no sufficiently good reason for God not to do so. 5, God has a duty to benefit non-human animals with interest by giving them eternal, infinitely good afterlives. That follows from 1 through 4. 6, God acts in accordance with God's duties. 7, animal universalism, i.e. the view that all non-human animals with interest will receive an eternal, infinitely good afterlife, is true. And this follows from premises 5 and 6.
So, Alex, we talked about this earlier today. Do you want to unpack this a bit? You want to put the thing up?
That's great. Yeah. And it'll be helpful for the audience, but also for me, because I'm getting old and I can't remember things. So we were talking about this earlier, and I've got to say I quite like this argument. You know, it's quite plausible actually. Most of the premises are quite plausible, and I was thinking to myself, actually, good job, Cameron. This is a pretty good argument here. So then I thought,
I think it's Dustin Crumit's argument, actually.
Yeah. This is an investigative rabbit hole I went through. I was thinking maybe this comes from Doherty's book. No, it doesn't. And then I watched the full video where he gives the reference. So it's a paper by Dustin Crumit, which is why it's a good argument and why I found it initially plausible. Dustin's work is like that. So initially I was thinking, I guess, you know, throw away all the Bible stuff, because that doesn't move me whatsoever. But maybe I now actually am a believer, or at least sympathetic towards the hypothesis on the philosophical grounds, at least. You know, after all, where am I going to be? It's obviously valid. There's no point in question about the logical form. It's just a question of which of the premises would I think is false if I want to resist the conclusion. And the first one just seems to be a very agreeable statement about what moral duty is. Right? It's just, it's no cost to me, but somebody else is suffering, I could help them, then I should do. I think everybody agrees. You'd find something very similar to that in, say, Derek Parfit or, someone like Peter Singer, standard view. 2 also seems pretty agreeable because it just says that some non-human animals, those with interests. Anyway, but some animals certainly have moral standing. We think that it's wrong to make them suffer, right? Obviously, I don't think premise 3 is true like in the literal sense because I don't think God exists. But it's easy enough to read it going along with it. The idea of God, the character of God, is certainly is as an agent who could benefit non-human animals with interest by giving them eternal, infinitely good after. Of course, right? He's an omnipotent being, so certainly could do that. Premise 4. I agree. Premise 4 does seem to me to be true. Right? There is no sufficiently good reason for God not to do so. I mean, why not? He should give everybody the afterlife, it seems to me. Why not? It doesn't cost him anything. It'd be great for us. He should do that, definitely. Then 5 follows from 1 to 4. God acts in accordance with God's duties. I guess you can, there are some sort of theological disputes there, but broadly speaking, that seems right as well. And then animal universalism follows from all of it. So I was struggling before to try and work out what I'm going to say about this argument rather than just endorsing it, right? But when we were talking about it over lunchtime today, I was starting to think that there's some kind of parody sort of version of this argument that illustrates, not parody, but like maybe parity is a better word, but another argument that like shows the tensions that can be generated between this and other strategies that you might endorse. So real quick one to get going is just if you're a skeptical theist, right, which is someone who says, whose response to problem of evil would be to say something like, maybe God does have a morally sufficient reason for, say, allowing the Holocaust or whatever, and it's just beyond our ken, so we couldn't know about that. After all, you couldn't possibly know about all of God's reasons. Maybe he has a reason you don't know about. If you take that line against the problem of evil, now premise 4 seems to be pretty difficult to sustain because that's exactly the thing you were denying when it came to the problem of evil. So you can't do both of them. So if you like the beneficence argument, you should be rationally compelled to not be a skeptical theist.
That's right.
And I should just interrupt because I wanted to know whether Cameron says positive things about skeptical theism, and he does. He does endorse skeptical theism. Now, of course, that's only an argument against Cameron, not an argument against us. But it's an argument against anyone who takes that view that skeptical theism is a valid response to the problem of evil. That's right. It highlights a tension between the two arguments. Anyway, depersonalizing it. I'm not interested in like showing that Cameron's foolish or something like that. But it's something like an idealized agent shouldn't really be doing both skeptical theism and the beneficence argument. But and I'm not sure that this is entirely clear, so bear with me a little bit. But I think that there's a sort of version of that type of parity where we can apply Trent Doherty's specific theodicy and show that there's a tension between that and this argument as well in a similar way. And here I'm going to just sort of summarize the argument from your paper. So I guess I shouldn't be doing this, but just quickly allow me and tell me if I'm getting this right. That in Doherty's argument, the idea is something that's real super quick is something about like, the animals who suffer whilst they're alive don't get this Swinburne sort of opportunities to defend their cubs and become all noble or whatever whilst they're alive. I think he says something like, we have to assume most of the soul building happens after you die, for the animals at least as well. So I think I think that the idea is supposed to be that you're compensating animals by giving them an afterlife. But in particular, Doherty's quite keen on the idea that they are becoming fully rational to saint-like, which meant, as we were talking about before, that they, in full comprehension of the suffering that they went through and its place in the wider cosmic plan,
come to understand that it's actually good, and that it's, they stop thinking that God has treated them unfairly, and kind of accept what the horrors that they went through. Now, as you guys are saying in the paper, what sort of thing could he say to them to get them to come to that conclusion? It's a sort of promissory note that there is something that God could say that would explain it all perfectly well. But obviously, Doherty's not giving us that, and we're not actually told in particular what it is that God could do to sort of make you think that all of that was okay. And it does seem rather implausible. Is there no limit to the horrors that you could endure for God to sort of tell you the secret to make them all go away and you feel okay about that? I'm not sure about that. That seems very plausible, but nonetheless, it's an appeal to a hitherto unknown, basically compensating moral reason that God might have for, it's not a moral reason, but it's a kind of explanation, justifying explanation that God might have available to him, right? Right, now let's switch over to this argument. And again, on premise 4, there's no sufficiently good reason for God not to give non-human animals an afterlife. I mean, maybe there is. I mean, maybe giving loads of animals, maybe even anybody, an infinite afterlife actually is, necessarily leads to madness or something, or tedium of infinity or something. So maybe it's bad to do that. In which case, what you want to do is resurrect the animal or the person, boost them up to full rationality, give them the explanation that justifies all of their suffering, so that they say, okay, I see your point. I'm now no longer annoyed with that. I accept what happened. And I accept the need for you to immediately annihilate me with no afterlife whatsoever. Maybe that's what's going on. And because we don't know, because it was just an appeal to this sort of mysterious explanation, you don't know that that's not the thing. It could be that. Right? After all, it's not like Doherty's saying here's this, it's here's the thing, and here's the reason why this must be the thing. It's just sort of pointing in the general direction of an explanation. So I feel like maybe it still undermines this part of the argument too, because maybe that scenario is right. So in which case, and I don't really see how you can rule that out whilst maintaining the Trent Doherty's version of the animal afterlife soul building thing. So I think that there might be, maybe this isn't wrong with what I just said there, but a bit like what I just quickly gave with the skeptical theism causes problems for premise 4. I think probably Trent Doherty's view causes problems for premise 4 too, and it might be so strong that you have to pick between them, which would be quite cute if that was the case. But yeah, that was the idea, I think, broadly speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I should just emphasize that the notion comes from Chisholm and Adams. It's called defeat. This idea that the sufferer endorses what happened to them. So that basically when the animal sort of wakes up in heaven, they develop a rational soul such that they can understand the God's grand plan and why all the suffering was necessary for the virtues of sainthood and so on and so forth. Right. So when they look at it and they go, oh yeah, it makes sense. I endorse it. They have to endorse it. That's the point. That's why Trent Doherty needs them to be rational animals. All right. So that's what's needed. But yeah, once they've endorsed it, they can just be wiped from existence, right? There's no, that's done now. So the other thing I was thinking, and was that this argument, isn't it just the problem of evil? Like, isn't it just exactly the same? Like, if it's basically saying, like, if there's a good God, God should do good things. It's a good thing to have an animal afterlife, so animals should have an animal afterlife. But I could just make exactly the same argument and say, well, it's a good thing not to have a global flood. It's a good thing, that animals don't die in tar pits. And make a long list of all the things, that you think look bad and say that shouldn't be seen on God. So I could just run this exact same argument and just conclude God doesn't exist because, hey, but notice that the point is that we look at the world and we say, oh, lots and lots of animal suffering. If God was good, he wouldn't have all this animal suffering, kind of basically this argument. But what this argument has is the animal afterlife. That's what we should expect, which is the one thing we cannot check. Rather convenient. Ken, what do you think?
Well, and we might conclude, we might come to question, does God actually act in accordance with God's duties? Or maybe God just doesn't have any duties. Or we might think, yeah, as Alex was saying, maybe there is some, if you're going to kind of be skeptical theist about, the animal suffering we actually observe, maybe there is some reason that God can't grant them an afterlife. I mean, so we can't be confident in premise 4 then if we're going to go that route. Right?
Who was the theologian that said animals are actually demons? And
Well,
that they've
yeah,
been
it was I forget his name. He was a Catholic priest or monk in the Renaissance or late Middle Ages, who wrote a book arguing that, well, here's the solution, like animals.
Was it Bougiant? I think I've got Bougiant. Is that the name that sounds
I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think he was excommunicated or threatened, made to recant. But this would, solve the problem. Like, he probably used Jesus casting the demons into pigs as a pretext. Like, see, I mean, maybe they're all just demons, and so they deserve it for their sin of, following Lucifer or whatever. But I would say one thing though. Maybe we should talk about this, not on this episode, but sometime. There is a way out of all of this, which is just to embrace some form of utilitarianism and hold that the benefit that God derives from all of this suffering is so awesome, so outweighs the aggregate suffering, that it's a kind of utility monster applied to God. So imagine God just is the cosmic utility monster. And so he's good. I mean, supposing utilitarianism is a correct moral theory, this problem dissolved. It might appeal.
And that's important because I think Trent Doty says that his view is like logically entailed from basic theism or mere Christianity. Like, well, it's logically entailed. I mean, there could be all kinds of crazy ideas like that.
Yeah,
that might be true.
This seems like the kind of Calvinist view applied, classic Calvinist view applied, because in that view, God, it says right in the Westminster Confession, like God has consigned most of humanity to hell, predetermined that they end up in hell for His own glory and His own reasons, right? And the utility monster theory like solves it nicely. So he's like, there's no. He's still acting good, by utilitarian lights. It seems monstrous, but, just get used to it. Utilitarianism has some counterintuitive consequences. So this is one of them, and it solves the problem of evil. It's not evil for God to do all this, to inflict suffering on humans and animals, because God really enjoys it.
It's like there's another version of that, which is that it's not so much that God really enjoys it, but that He gives you a good that's so good, infinite time and maximum pleasure in the afterlife. That what's the pesky couple of years in a concentration camp in comparison to that, whatever. Right? You can sort of swamp the evil with like a ridiculously huge compensatory goods or whatever. But okay, but what that's doing is it's like saying, it's really hard to think that like that's reasonable as a response to the problem of evil, but that the homeless guy who wanders into the ER room and happens to have like a functioning liver and functioning heart and lungs or whatever, just at the same time when there's like 5 people dying who need exactly those things, right? There's a utility to just killing the homeless guy who's got no family and doesn't know his own name or whatever because he's drunk all the time. Just harvest the organs from him, and that utility good, right? But the mind recoils against that because it's like, there's this deep ingrained sort of Kantian intuition. It's something that you shouldn't do. It doesn't matter about the consequences, right? Killing people for utility is bad. But, that's just what's going on with all of these compensatory good theories. Any version of this, whether it's Swinburne's or if it's Doherty's or anything, the idea that like there is something you can do to someone who's gone through the Holocaust that makes it okay to let them go through it. And that, that offends some principles buried deep inside my brain. I like consequentialism, but there has to be a limit to it, it seems to me. And only the most rampant consequentialist can sort of go down these pathways.
Yeah. This is very well expressed in the rebellion section of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan Karamazov says, look, even if there is this great compensatory good and we're all, it's like, I mean, this is something still like sick about this, and I'm turning my ticket now, rebelling again.
So let's move on to the penultimate clip here.
Under Christian theology, our resurrected bodies have new characteristics and abilities. Jesus, for example, was likely able to walk through walls. And it seems like from the passages we read earlier, scripture seems to indicate that creation itself will be radically transformed. So, if animals are resurrected, then it stands to reason that they too will be transformed at the eschaton. Doherty proposes that one of the ways that animals will be transformed is that they'll receive rational resurrection bodies. A side note here is that Doherty's view does not commit you to the view that animal rationality will look identical to human rationality. A rational pig may look very different from a rational human. This view only requires the kind of rationality necessary for animals to reflect on, own, and grow from prior experiences, however that may look for any individual animal. But one way to think about this is basically that these animals, their evolutionary story, will basically just take a huge leap forward. Now, I actually think that this view is pretty interesting. Not only does this extension of soul building seem to solve the problem of animal suffering, it's also caused me to think really deeply about the way that I treat animals. So if you're wondering, yes, I know how this sounds. When you first hear it, it can sound very strange or maybe even silly, but that's also true of lots of theories in science when they were first introduced. The Big Bang, the term Big Bang was actually pejorative at first, if you didn't know that. The original proposal was seen by many scientists as silly. If anything, what I would encourage you to do is don't dismiss this idea as somehow like alien to Christianity. Under Christianity, Jesus underwent very serious physical changes when he was resurrected. And as I already mentioned, Christ's resurrection body could very likely walk through walls. In the New Testament, Christians are promised that their bodies will be glorified in a similar manner. And if you recall the passages from Isaiah and Romans, these passages seem to indicate that it's not just humans that will be transformed, but animals as well.
All right, quick nerdy fact. The Big Bang was not a pejorative term recently. That's false. That's a myth. We go into that in our book, Battle of the Big Bang, you can read that when it comes out. But it seems to me like the reason, the Big Bang is very strange and odd. But we're forced into it by overwhelming evidence. Are we forced into an animal afterlife plus the, nullification, like we call it? I think he calls it theosis, of these animals. Are we forced into that by overwhelming evidence? Same as the Big Bang. I don't think it's a ridiculous comparison to make.
Yeah.
The other point is that I don't think, Cameron's sort of missing the key point of Doherty's theodicy here. That is that the animals, the reason that they have to have their rationality is that they have to endorse it afterwards. And that's the bit that I find like just so hard to believe. Imagine you're an animal, you've woken up in heaven after the flood, and you say, why did I have to experience this horrendous thing? 40 days and nights I saw all my kittens drown, and then I saw everything else die slowly, and then I died in a horrible, torturous death. Why was that? And God says, well, it's for my great plan, or it's because humans sin. And they're supposed to go, yeah, okay, all right, I'm with you now. That's the bit that to me just seems so implausible. And that's what Cameron doesn't mention. I mean, as implausible as a rational talking animal is, I don't think that's the most implausible bit.
Well, the walking through walls is also impressive. So I'm glad my cats can't walk through walls now.
Your cats can't walk through walls because my cats seem like they can. Like they just sort of appear and disappear. So I don't know what your cats are doing. But also, isn't it like a really expensive auxiliary hypothesis here? Alex, what do you think?
I think what's going on these clips is not for us, really. It's just, if you already buy stuff about Jesus having his body transformed in the afterlife, then you shouldn't be so worried about animals having their bodies transformed in the afterlife. Yeah. All right, fine, whatever. If I believed in the X-Men, I wouldn't be that surprised if Star Wars was true as well, I guess. I mean, whatever.
But kind of likening it to, new scientific theories and the resistance to new, it's like, I mean, really? I'm kind of reminded of I was on this panel once, which was like with a bunch of representatives of different religious groups, and I was representing atheists and agnostics. And there was a Mormon guy on there who was saying that like the story of the golden plates and all that it's like science. I remember saying, like, really? He observed the plates. Science involves observation. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't know.
But the thing is, resistance to new novel ideas in science is what we expect. Like, that's what we demand. We don't accept crazy sounding ideas until they've passed the test of overwhelming evidence.
That's right. Yeah.
And the evidence for this is conveniently shielded from us.
Yeah, we can't really do it's not like we can do a lot of investigations to figure out if this is, and does it explain a bunch of other observable things and so on.
Right. All right. So then we'll go to the very last clip now.
Other way of sort of thinking about this. Animals developing rational faculties would kind of be similar to an infant simply like growing older, right? Infants aren't necessarily born with all of their rational abilities. These abilities develop over time. And don't atheists believe that humans develop their rationality over time? So like, why couldn't God do something like that for animals, just like quicker, like faster? Bro, God is omnipotent. Developing animal rationality would be super easy, barely an inconvenience for God. And yet it's not difficult to see how their evil can be defeated. Not only will each of them receive limitless compensation in the afterlife, they'll each have a chance to exercise many of the greatest virtues, like forgiveness. They'll be able to grow and develop their character. And this is why I said that the strongest versions of soul building require animal mortality. And plus, I just think this extension of soul building is really, really cool. I really like thinking about it a lot.
Well, it's interesting that he sort of focuses on the compensation because, I mean, even Doherty has this example of, he calls it the Gatinator, where Bill Gates turns up at your house with like his minions, smashes up your house, and then gives you destroys lots of family heirlooms and pictures that you treasured and stuff like that, and then gives you $1 billion. You've been clearly compensated, but you certainly wouldn't want to say Bill Gates was justified in what he did. So, and also the other thing is, and this is Doherty doesn't mention, is that Gates could have given you that money without the suffering, right? So if you can get the compensatory goods without the suffering, why the suffering in the first place? It doesn't seem explained. And then one last point I want to make is that, again, Cameron misses this thing about that they have to endorse the suffering that they've experienced. That's the key point that Doherty's making, as I understand it. I mean, he's probably going to tell me I've misunderstood Doherty or whatever, but maybe we have. But that's how I understand it. And what if they don't? What happens to these animals if they hear the reason, they see God's great plan, and they go, nah, I don't endorse it.
They're like,
they might go to hell. So now this animal afterlife concept could make animal suffering enormously worse because it was the case that they just suffered in this life. But now, if we expect them to be rational, I mean, they're going to be like, in fact, Doherty says that humans are going to be like gods and animals are going to be like humans, right? Now, as I as a human, and I look at the suffering of the world and I go, nah, that's not justified. I don't like God, right? So I go to hell. Now, if the animals become humans, well, why don't they do the same? They could do exactly the same. And now this whole animal afterlife thing has just made the problem of animal suffering enormously worse.
Well, God could just allow a bunch of, grumpy grumpy animals and humans in the afterlife, like Ivan Karamazov, like, yeah, they're here. Isn't this great? Yeah, it's great, but doesn't really. Maybe God doesn't have to send us to hell for it. He could just,
right,
let us be the grump.
Yeah, we have the same potential reward as animals on this view, but a much tougher time getting to the reward. Right? We actually have a worse deal than the animals do on this, because there's conditions I have to fulfill. Ask a different Christian what they think the conditions are, and their answers might vary, but something like believing that Jesus died for our sins and maybe following the 10 Commandments or something. But animals aren't under any of those obligations, yet they go to heaven, right? But I might fuck up on the way and go to hell. It seems like it's proposing a new problem of evil or something, a problem of double standards or something. That's like God's not applying the rules in accordance with our moral value or something. I'm worth at least as much as my dog in terms of the deserving an afterlife, surely.
That's good. Yeah, God should have. We should have just all been animals instead of non-human animals.
We'd all been humans. But why have this apartheid system where some people get straight into heaven and other people get sorted on the basis of whether they believe something or not? It seems very unfair.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. All right. So we wrap it up there. Anything else? Anyone else have anything they want to add, or should we wrap it up there? Good. All right. Well, we'll finish up there. Thank you so much for watching. If you made this far, Please give us a like, subscribe, and put any comments you have, any disagreements, any phrases, any suggestions for new shows. Feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll see you next time on the SciPhi Show.